Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today, this is going to be a quick and dirty session about the Sage Staff +6. I have finally forged it after a year and a half of grinding as of this morning. I've only known one other person personally who's done it. I know there's a small handful in Global that have been able to actually achieve this, and so I figured I'd tell you about how much time I wasted doing it, whether or not it's actually worth it, whether or not I recommend it, and where it actually has some potential use in the game. So let's actually look at the staff itself. When you +6 it, you have the option of the Vital, the Magic, or the Aim builds. The Magic does seem to be statistically the best one overall. The Aim build, while still having some relatively balanced stats, the 14 accuracy really isn't that impactful compared to what else you can get. The effects of it, though, when you do +6 it, are accuracy of 20, magic attack of 20, and the decrease attack skill activation time of 250. So overall, the strengths of this are that 255 magic stat, the free accuracy of 20 per se, that anyone you put it on will have that, which is more accuracy than what you get from a Truststone passive, but certainly equal to what you get to an Alexandrite ring, which really kind of undercuts everything about this staff. The magic attack of 20 certainly is cool that it's the highest, but it's only higher by 5 modifier, really not that strong overall. And the decreased activation skill time of 250, while 250 is the highest you can get compared to the Truststone passive of 200, there's really not a ton of breakpoints where that extra 50 ends up mattering, and we're going to go through some calcs and some eligible characters for that. So the acquisition process overall to get that, well, number one, you definitely need the Royal Rank Pack. It's about 13,000 Visior. To acquire enough recipes to get to +4, that'll save you about a year and a half of grinding. You still need 32 more recipes after you do that, though. The 32 recipes at 15,000 medals is a total of 480,000 medals that you'll need. Now, if you do finish in the top 50 every day, which is what I did, gives you 1,000 medals per day, and you can't only do that. Obviously, that would be 480 days to acquire. You need to grind up to as high as you can get every day, which gives you about 20 medals per win. So if you're refreshing 7 to 8 times per day, anywhere in that range, you can get upwards of 700 medals a day from grinding. Still an incredible amount of days and consistency of having just to do it every single day to maintain. The 5-time bonus weeks are absolutely clutch. You can usually get 2 recipes in those weeks. Those 20 medals per win end up being 100 medals per win, so it's a really quick way to end up acquiring a ton of them, particularly because a lot of people are active in Arena that week, which means you can get to very high refresh amounts. And then one of the harder things is just straight up keeping up with the bonus units and the time spent to build your teams and do the grind. Loading screens suck for this. When you have to do battles 35 times and you're just sitting there waiting for a loading screen, it gets pretty monotonous and pretty boring after a while. But then obviously the time it takes to manage your team and what their TMRs are and the trust stones to be there. Obviously it is kind of like a throw viz and win to some degree. But at the same time, you actually do have to make a good team and skill scout the enemies that you can beat relatively easily. The point is that there is a time investment to be had for deciding what team you can use and how to min-max it and making sure you can win consistently to maintain your streaks. All obviously very time consuming. Now, do I recommend it? No, definitely not. We're going to see here in a moment the Sage staff, although probably is technically the best staff in the game, by how much so is really so negligible that when you talk about the time it takes and all of what we were just going over, really not end up being worth it. That being said, there is some silver lining. You do get 9 crafting medals a day for the top 50, which again, over a year or year and a half plus, you're able to essentially +6 really anything you want and have an overflow of crafting medals to do so. The hammer rewards at the end of the week are a big help with trust stones, where if you are moving a lot of passives around and investing heavily in time with trust stones, the constant accumulation of hammers at the end of the week certainly does help. And honestly, it still is a great learning experience to be able to test characters against other teams. One of the downsides of something like Guild Wars is that your level of competition is just who's in your guild. And so if you have guildmates who aren't changing their teams frequently, or not for nothing, aren't making very good teams, so you're not getting a very good level of competition, if you will. At least being in the top 50 of Arena, you are able to see your enemies build, you're able to do some theory crafting on what wins, you're able to stress test certain numbers, and quite frequently, it's the same map as your Guild War map, so it is kind of cool to be able to field a handful of different teams in Arena, and use some of that knowledge to apply it into Guild Wars as well. So there is some silver linings to staying active with it, it's just the reward of the Sage staff isn't necessarily worth it by itself. Now, the other staffs, if we're just kind of looking at this general list, this is not an exhaustive list. I have them sorted here by magic stat, and then just some of what they have for attributes and what they might have for modifiers. 255 magic stat is heads and tails above most of them, but really not materially far above some of the other ones here. It really just comes down to how important the decreased skill activation time, the accuracy, and the magic attack is. As you can see, many other staffs have magic attack ranging anywhere from 10 to 15. If you're a lightning or a light unit, the extra modifier that you get from the Prunus Lamina +6 obviously greatly increases the damage. 35 total modifier as opposed to 20 total modifier. The Prunus Lamina also has decreased skill activation of 200, so if you're talking about freeing up a Trust Stone passive slot, you can already do it here. You don't have to have the Sage's Staff to free up that Trust Stone passive slot. And then honestly, there's a lot of other staffs that have some excellent utility that do have some more wide-ranging and consistent benefits. You can make the argument that the Cypress Pile alone, having that extra magic resistance 20, is more consistent for damage output. The Magistral Rod, for having the light and dark resistance of 7%, frees up 2 potential Trust Stone passive slots. If you are going for min-maxing your magic stat, oftentimes it is more beneficial to use a staff in the TMR slot, so that way you retain the full magic stats of your Trust Stone. So even the magic stat, it's not heads and tails above many of the other ones, and oftentimes a lot of them offer things that just have more widespread usage. So let's talk about the practical usage of who can actually equip the Sage Staff, when and why. So if we're kind of going through process of elimination here, I'm just going to kind of take off some characters that are essentially power crept for the top end of the game, and it doesn't make them bad, but if we're looking at the strengths, again, 50 more magic than the next highest. Still not a huge improvement when you consider that a TMR staff with the Trust Stones can come close to that same magic staff. The 50 extra cast time down does change some breakpoints for some characters, not all of them. The free accuracy of 20 at all times certainly is nice, that most of these staff units aren't very accurate, so it is kind of a small power creep thing to allow them to get that extra hit rate in there. And so yeah, if we're going through process of elimination of who really would use this staff, we're going to kind of take 2 off the bat here with Medina and Killif. They're both just kind of power crept for the top end of the game, so we're going to omit them for the moment. The next 2 are Minwu and Gargus, who do have their own weapons respectively from the selection quest, which are quite honestly better for them individually than what the Sage Staff has to offer. Not that you couldn't use it on them, just not to their strengths. If we're then going to go through some of the supports here, again, not that supports don't want to use this. Obviously, the extra magic stat does help them with their curative potential in terms of what they end up healing in totality. The downside here, though, is that because these are technically healers or supports, their AI isn't offensive oriented, which means that extra 20 accuracy and the attack cast time down of 250 is only applicable for when they are actually attacking, when you need to make sure they hit someone, and minimizing their skill cast time. Well, they're not known for really attacking, so it's not necessarily a massive upgrade for them because most of their time is spent healing. It's really just those niche scenarios where they are attacking where you might get some benefit. And if we're looking at who's remaining here, even Sakura and Skahal, they probably prefer the Prunus Lamina just because of the extra damage modifier from that weapon. And although, yes, it is slightly less magic, it still technically does have the cast time of 200. It's really just a question of whether or not their breakpoints change because of the Sage Staff. And spoiler alert for Sakura, really doesn't. It might a little bit in the future when she gets her MA2 upgrade of 300 cast time down. Obviously, she's very prevalently used in things like limited Guild War and cost-limited events. But I think it's a really tough argument to be had to say whether the difference of 1 tick or 2 ticks is worth losing out on the extra modifier potential, which process of elimination leaves us with, what, 4 characters here? So the actual practical usage of this weapon is pretty capped. Now, if we're looking at some of the breakpoints on the eligible remaining damage dealers, and these assumptions that I'm going to do here, we're going to assume you have an Esper that has cast time reduction of 200. The Mastery ability obviously applies all the time as well. And we're going to look at 2 different hypotheticals. One, if you had the Sage Staff equipped, or if you instead just had a regular staff and the 200 Trust Stone passive equipped instead. I'm going to go through these super fast. This is really just kind of show how little impact there really is. Sakura does not have any cast time down on a mastery ability, and so she's effectively exactly the same for breakpoints, whether you have Sage Staff or not. That extra 50 does not make any difference in any of her abilities. Now, I did also run some tests here where I also assumed things like if you did equip their passive, and honestly the results didn't change that much, so I'm not going to exhaust that for you here. I'm just going to keep this one scenario in the meantime. If we look then at Renan, the difference between using the Sage Staff and the 200 Trust Stone passive, he actually does get a breakpoint advantage here on Thunderbolt, where that will be an instacast instead of waiting only 1 tick. So, okay, we've finally seen our one scenario where this one character who does have some limited usage, if you will, finally gets some benefit to the cast time down. If we look at the next unit here, Golbez, he actually does also get some benefit here where all of his abilities are now insta-castable. If you instead only use the Trust Stone passive, Abyssal Kesar would use 1 tick, but the rest of his Meteor Drain and Imperil on those sub-jobs and whatnot would be insta-casted anyways. The Sage Staff now allows his main damaging ability to be insta-cast, which sure is worth something, but it's Golbez we're talking about. Now, if we look at Black Rosalina, the big caveat for her is that so far I've not included any of the cast time down passives because they're not always optimal to equip, but on her main passive that gives her the magic buff, the one that you basically have on at all times, it does have 200 cast time down on that passive. So for the purpose of, practical usage here, I'm going to assume that you have that passive equipped, and if you have Valfor and the 200 Trust Stone passive down, she can insta-cast everything. The Sage Staff does absolutely nothing for any breakpoints for her. Which finally brings us to Skahal, which I'm sure a lot of people are interested to see the results on here. And the answer is yes, he actually does have two abilities that are insta-cast instead of waiting just one tick, Thunder and Toad. Here's the thing though, those are not his most powerful or most popularly used abilities. The Thundaga Disposer, the Thundaga and Flare abilities, and Energy Buster being the 100% hit chance are used far more often than Thunder and Toad, so that although, yes, that's kind of cool that those are both insta-castable now, practically speaking, they're not the ones that he goes to the most, so really not a big change. So just kind of circling back here on the total list of stabs, yes, the Sage Staff plus 6 is a small power creep to many of them in terms of giving that little bit of extra magic stat, a little bit of extra decreased skill activation time for characters where applicable. And don't get me wrong, there are also obviously some of these support characters that this does change their cast times, because a lot of them don't have cast time down on their mastery abilities, but it's so niche, not even worth doing the analysis on. But I haven't really seen any videos examining or doing a deep dive on Sage Staff plus 6. Figured it was a topic that I saw come up on Reddit a couple weeks ago where someone was talking about it and was kind of interested. Figured I'd share my experience in finally getting it, and we'll actually see if I actually get any use out of it. I'm going to assume that I'm probably not, but it was a fun experience. I'm glad I got the achievement of being able to acquire it. And who knows, maybe I'll prove myself wrong and actually find some benefit. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll talk to you all soon.